Welcome to the Erasing Shame Podcast, Season 1. This podcast is about erasing shame through honest talk for healthy living, emotionally, relationally, mentally, and personally. Visit our website at erasingshame.com for links to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe on iTunes and YouTube. Now, let's have an honest talk for healthy living. Hey, welcome back to Erasing Shame through Honest Talk for Healthy Living. My name is DJ Chuang, and I'm here with my co-host, Eunice Lee. And this is episode number 3, titled Not Belonging Anywhere. It's great to see you again. Eunice, how was your weekend?
It was good. And it was Lunar New Year this weekend, right? And President's Day, which was a funny juxtaposition that we're celebrating our Asianness and Americanness, if that's a word. So, yeah.
That's a bonus.
How was your weekend, DJ?
Good. We celebrated with a family dinner at a contemporary Chinese restaurant next to Portos in Buena Park.
Oh.
If you're familiar with that. So, contemporary Chinese just means Americanized Chinese.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah. So I didn't grow up doing any Lunar New Year's things at all. And now I'm here in LA, and every mall and every kind of major structure is covered in all the decorations. So it's been interesting. I didn't know it was Lunar New Year until I was meeting up with a friend at Din Tai Fung in Glendale in LA, and it was really packed with a lot of families that I guess had been waiting all year for this event, and felt like a bad Asian because I did not know until I got there. So yeah, it was interesting. I was just thinking about, though, the kind of our relationship to Lunar New Year can sometimes, it's kind of like our relationship to our Asian American identity, or how intimate we feel towards our Asianness, if that makes sense. I have a friend who every year does like a Lunar New Year celebration, and she makes dumplings, and it's always weird to go because I've never really engaged in that part of my Asianness as someone from the East Coast, where they didn't do a lot of public celebrations. So
I think I did that once in my lifetime. And I have this longing to celebrate Chinese New Year making dumplings, but it wasn't in my family. So it was one time with a family friend that we did that. And it was so yummy.
Yeah.
But I haven't found a friend that will do that for us.
Yeah. You have to find that friend. Yeah, totally. Yeah. So, I mean, I was just thinking about how, like, even in that moment, I was with my friend who is not Asian American, and she's like, "You don't know if this is Lunar New Year," and I kind of felt this shame, even in and of itself, of like, "Oh, I should have known. I should have said something. I should have like kind of put on my calendar. I don't know." And then we get out to it was in Glendale, so we get out to the Galleria, and then there's a huge red lantern, like 6 feet across, and I was a little embarrassed. But yeah, I think that there's always elements of our lives where we feel, like for me, I feel not Asian enough in those moments. Like I didn't achieve that status of cultural integration in it myself, because I didn't know what Lunar New Year is. Or basically anytime I step into K-Town and try to pretend that I'm not Korean so they won't speak to me in Korean. So I feel that's kind of what we're talking about today, is that not quite belonging in one place or another place, not quite belonging in the majority culture, but also not really belonging in the Asian culture completely.
Yes, exactly. And that feeling can be very isolating and lonely, and just feels really bad. And there's something about our humanness that comes out when we are connected with people. And even I'm reminded of that movie Castaway, when Tom Hanks was the character and he was on a deserted island by himself, that for him to keep his humanity alive, he created another human representative in a volleyball so that he could have conversation, have life flow through him.
Yeah, that's such a great example, because we're always looking for those mirrors, right? That mirroring of ourselves. I think it can be really hard as Asian Americans, because we identify with our American culture, but then we look so much like our relatives and our friends overseas that sometimes it can be really hard. like I know for me growing up in Virginia, I was asked a lot of almost the opposite of my experience here in LA, which is that everyone's embracing Asianness and asking me about what K-dramas I watch or what K-pop I like and things like that. Which, by the way, in the 90s, it was not cool to be Korean, but now for some reason it's really cool to be Korean. So I feel like I missed the boat there. Um, but I got a lot of questions
Very
growing
funny.
up. Oh, I didn't even think about that. I got a lot of questions though of like, where are you really from? I don't know if you've ever gotten that. Like, where are you really from? Or I got this a lot was, are you from North or South Korea?
Mhm.
Or what does your name mean in Korean? My name is Eunice. It's not a Korean name. It just Korean people really like it. Um, but I remember that really distinctly growing up, almost having to prove that I was born in the hospital down the street, that I, 100% like live and breathe American, and almost this tension there too. Like I don't quite belong, even though this is where I feel like I fit.
Yes, it's such a common story I hear when I am around Asian Americans, and I've experienced it myself, that because we are raised in an Asian culture family, but we grew up in America, going to American schools, going to American college, going to American supermarkets and American workplaces
Mhm.
where it's not Asian, that it feels like we have to navigate two very different sets of cultures and behaviors and values.
Mhm.
And it it's confusing sometimes. It's feeling like you can never let your guard down because you have to figure out, okay, I'm in this context, I got to behave this way, and you have to be conscious about it. And that gets
Yeah.
tiring. And it would be nice if you could just be somewhere and just be yourself instead of having to be something that you
Mhm.
aren't really.
Yeah. I think it's kind of like what you're saying, kind of having your guard up. It's actually a value in Asian culture to be able to read the room and anticipate people's
Mm,
emotions. And that's on top of that, that's what I think a lot of people have to do when they have to navigate from two cultures, is have to read the room and see what they can say and what's acceptable culturally and what's not. Um, because there's like a dual value set, and it's really hard to know what to pick and choose from.
hmm hmm Well, I came to the States when I was 8 years old in second grade, and all I knew was speaking Mandarin at the time.
Mm.
So I was always very conscious of my Asianness since being 8. And I remember going to visit the elementary school that was in our neighborhood, and I was starting to learn English there through a ESL program, English as a second language. And one of the first phrases I learned was, "How do you do?"
Mm.
And that was easy for me to say because um, "do" is a similar. There's a homonym in Mandarin Chinese that sounds
Mhm.
like that. So there are certain phrases I could pick up pretty easily, and the other ones were just really tough. But
Mhm.
because I was part of ESL, I got teased by other people that were just part of the school,
Mhm.
and I was always reminded of my differentness.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, I grew up in the US and kind of was always I did Girl Scouts, I did ballet, I did soccer. I kind of had that very typical American upbringing. We just looked different. And so I never really noticed it until about kindergarten or first grade, when people would ask me questions about my culture. Um, and it wasn't until college. I remember sitting in a room full of Asian people and thinking, I'm the only white person here. And then
Mm,
realizing that I'm actually not. So my kind of awareness of Asianness came much later. I was about 20. Um,
mm,
yeah. Well, so I think even as we talk about this, I don't think this feeling of being other and our stories are just specific to, like, the shame of being other. I don't think it's specific to just Asian American experiences, because there's always going to be something that causes us to feel other. I think of
mhm,
a friend who's a 6 foot woman,
mm.
and she does not play basketball, but that's the first question everyone asks her is, do you play basketball? And I can imagine that it's a lot of like education. Like not all tall people play basketball, but it's
Yeah.
just we have these frameworks in our minds. um, and so I think in the like, and then kind of in the same vein, us as Asian Americans talking about this, there's kind of this experience of always having to educate people on what
Mm,
Asian American is. And that question of, where are you really from? Where were you
mm.
born? Were your parents born? And if it's, the US for generations, it gets very tiring to have to share that over and over again. It can sometimes be a source of shame, I can imagine, for a lot of young people who don't feel like they can really belong one place or the other.
Yeah, and that can cause people to disconnect and
Mm-hmm.
hide, or they can swing to one extreme or the other. So I know some people that, and it tends to be in that college, young adult years when somebody really wrestles with their culture identity and they will identify with, and some will go all the way into their Asian culture and avoid non-Asian contexts so that
Mm-hmm.
they're comfortable.
Yeah.
Others will blend right into non-Asian context and reject and move away from anything Asian. And then everything,
Yeah.
and that's something that each of us have to kind of have a discussion about with ourselves and with a few friends, and just a sense of where we belong in that, and be okay with that.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a discussion. I think that that's the part I like about what you just said too, is that there has to be a discussion piece too, because I know that if we just say it's too confusing to be different, so I'm just trying to be the same, whether or not it's completely enveloping in our culture of origin or in majority culture, we're not getting the richness of that discussion and that processing with ourselves, and that's really what brings us growth and allows us to unearth our humanness.
Well, here's where it's painful for not being completely Asian for myself,
Mm-hmm.
and I've heard from others, is that sometimes I will be interacting with a first generation Chinese person,
Mm-hmm.
and they find out that I grew up in America and my Mandarin is pretty bad.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll shame me and say, "Oh, you should learn Chinese. You should be a
Mm-hmm.
good Chinese person and learn Chinese." And I don't know what it is in our culture that would do that,
Mm-hmm.
but that seems to be the part that's the shame-based culture.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's definitely like a culture of authority um,
Mm,
in Asian culture that allows for like older people to do that. We were selling our dining room table yesterday, and the
mm.
woman was Asian, and she was just looking at the house, and she said, "How many bedrooms?" Not something that you ask someone when you're just buying their dining room table, but in her context, it was fine, and we're Asian, and so
Mm.
whatever. So it's so funny that that happens. That was really shocking. Oh, okay, it's three, and we just answered. We didn't even know.
Let's move.
Think about it.
Let's move to our circle. And what are some other kinds of contexts where people feel like they don't belong and have that yearning to belong?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about this in the like this idea, watching a lot of those Super Bowl commercials and stuff. This idea of home is always a big deal. I think
Mm,
it's a universal human experience to feel like you want to belong.
mm-hmm,
Um, and we've all had that experience in high school in the cafeteria with our trays, looking at the different groups of people, trying to figure out where to sit, if we're going to sit with
mm-hmm,
the nerdy kids or the cool kids or the band kids or whatever. And I kind of feel like the Asian American experience is sometimes, unless you have a large population of Asian Americans at your school, is just kind of sitting by yourself or trying to fit in with another crowd that doesn't really match you.
mm-hmm.
Um, so I think it's a universal experience, and I've been watching a lot of This Is Us, which
Oh,
is a kind of big show on NBC right now,
yeah. What's the
and
show about?
it's about I don't know much to share because it would give away the first episode. It's about a family and
Okay.
some of their kind of their struggles and their trials, and so there's one character that's overweight and
Mm,
was based on the creator's sister. And
mm,
so the writers were asking her, can we have a storyline for Kate, who's the character's name, where
mm-hmm,
it's not about the weight? And she
mm,
basically said, it's always going to be about the weight. It's always about the
mm,
weight. Because that's unfortunately, even as the character progresses, that's her struggle because that's how people perceive her. Um, is what I took away from that. And I think
Wow.
it's that with being any sort of minority, whether it's, having a different type of religion or sexual orientation than what's the norm, or binary gender, or cultural, or like, difference. Like, I know people that are immigrants from Europe that are always asked for people to teach them how to do their accent. And so there's a
Mm.
curiosity there, but they're also hearing you're not one of us. And that's such a yearning that people have,
Hmm.
is to belong.
Yeah, there's a tendency for any group of people that are similar to
Mm-hmm.
look at someone else that might look different and call that out.
Mm-hmm.
And so for a person that tends to be on the heavier weight side, that might be the most obvious attribute
Mm-hmm.
that comes to mind. And so
Yeah.
they'll call that out. Hey, we got some comments from a viewer, so I'm going to read that on air. The duality also exists for Italian Americans, German Americans as well. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
just an Asian American thing, as we
Yeah.
talked about Asian Americanness. And
Mm-hmm.
then Zeke also says, I think some of the feelings of not belonging or otherness can be a reflection of societies and individuals' bias or lack of experience and
Mm-hmm.
lack of exposure to people of different backgrounds.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I mean, I think I agree. I think that
Mm.
there's a lot of the comments that I think anyone says, it's really out of some sort of ignorance, and sometimes they're really well intentioned too. Um, but it's yeah, like I just, some of the most kind of shocking questions I've gotten from people that just are curious to know. Um, and so unfortunately that is true. Um, but what it does for the person receiving it is
Mm-hmm.
having to manage all that emotionally, is that it can make them feel vulnerable and exposed and other, and feel ashamed to be themselves. And we talk about the definition of shame as being um, one where you didn't make a mistake, you are the mistake, or
Mm-hmm.
you didn't do something bad, you are bad. And so to
Mm-hmm.
get repeatedly, whether it's your culture or whether it's something else about you, if you're Italian American, German American, Asian American, that you're constantly being asked to explain yourself, after a while, it feels very shaming, even unintentionally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm wondering now that we're exploring this topic again, and it's coming up again, as we have 12 Asian Americans that are part of the American uh, Olympics team.
Mm-hmm.
And the racial thing is very much alive in our culture today,
Yeah.
in other ways as well, with the racial tensions. What's a better way for people to ask that question instead of where are you from?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I haven't found the answer yet, but I'm thinking off the top of my head, maybe they can ask, what's your ethnic background?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe where your parents from? I don't know.
I think as long as it's not the first question, I would feel more comfortable with
Ah,
it. I think
good
that's
point.
the order of the questions is important. I haven't found a perfect answer either, but I definitely feel like if that's the first thing, that's probably, it might not be the best thing
That's a good
to
thought.
say.
Yeah.
So, like, we did a poll on our
Yeah.
Facebook, and I'm wondering if you want to talk about
Oh, yeah.
those responses.
Yeah. So as we're getting this podcast rolling, we want to create some more opportunities for our listeners and our viewers to interact and respond with us so that we can have this conversation go beyond just the podcast episode. So we're starting a poll of the week with a question, and we asked the question this week, what do you do when you feel like you don't belong? And here's some of the responses we got. Withdraw, get anxious, and circle racing thoughts internally. And someone else said, eat ice cream.
I had one to add to that, which no one put, but I've heard a lot, is kind of perfectionism or performance,
Hmm.
which I noticed no one put, because I'm imagining that would be a very vulnerable thing to put on a Facebook. Facebook.
How would perfectionism be a response to not belonging?
To try harder to fit in, almost like there's
Oh,
hope. Yeah. So what do you think about the? I think it's interesting because there's two of them that are action oriented, and then one that's more of like an internal experience.
mhm.
But I can imagine they would go hand in hand. These two things.
Yes. Yeah. Some people work on the emotional level first, and then some people work on the physical level first, and then the feelings get articulated later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it sounds like there's like in that question, when what do you do when you feel like you don't belong? There's a message, right? That the person is receiving for not belonging, and it's like that they're less than or they're not good enough for their current situation. And I think that's so damaging. It's one of the lies that we often tell ourselves for being who we are, is that we're not good enough.
Yeah, that's the damaging part. There's also the dynamic when you're in certain groups, you feel like and you know you don't belong. So, for example, I go to a lot of conferences. So gone to conferences where I feel like I belong and I know the culture, I know the language because it's in the nonprofit world. But then I've started also going to some for-profit conferences where it's very sales-driven and people are very goal-oriented
Mm-hmm.
and everything's about closing the deal. And I obviously feel like I don't belong and I don't know the lingo.
Mm-hmm.
So in those cases, it's beyond just feeling bad about being me. It's also feeling like, well, what can I do because I don't know how to carry a conversation.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is it's almost like in those for-profit conferences where it's like your values don't match the values of the environment, or you don't match,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that can cause a lot of anxiety inside of us to not match. I think that's like a really terrible, like it's just not, it doesn't feel good to not match our environment.
Or yeah, match the people's expectations and what they do
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
or how they look.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, yeah, even for as you're talking about it, for myself, there have been times where, I've been in situations where I feel like I have to match um, the people around me, or else I won't be noticed, or I won't. Um, and I've heard this from other Asian Americans too, that they feel like they have to speak up first in classrooms and in other contexts, so that they'll be noticed, and also so that people will know they speak English.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, um, and those feelings of performing or withdrawing are pretty strong. So then how do we do this so we talked about erasing shame, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking now about some of the not great ways that we experience shame, and it cycles through us and it causes us to overeat and to withdraw and to get anxiety. So how can we um, experience shame in a positive way, I guess, or what do we do with these feelings? Because they're here and they're just part of the human experience.
Yeah, so perhaps the first thing is to realize it's normal in the human experience that there are times when we feel like we don't belong. And I guess we can go ahead and say, well, there's situations where you actually don't belong.
Mm-hmm.
But our response to that can be either to withdraw or eat ice cream,
Mm-hmm.
or we could do something else.
Yeah.
And it's to say, hey, or say to yourself, it's okay, I'm different, but maybe move towards curiosity to learn about the group,
Mm-hmm.
and to share a little bit about your life that you might find that you think might be valuable to the group to share.
Mm-hmm.
Do
Yeah.
you have some other thoughts too?
Yeah, I think that there's I really like that kind of the curiosity of what's going on in the group and trying to understand it. I think the ultimate thing is providing yourself or empowering yourself to be different. And kind of what you're saying, that curiosity of stepping outside yourself is self-empowering, because we have the tools to figure out our own story and our own narrative. And when we sit in shame, we're actually giving that power up to the people around us and allowing them to define us. When really, if we're able to engage with people and have real and genuine relationship, we're taking that power back and in ourselves, if that makes sense.
Now, say a little bit more about that. How does that work?
Yeah, well, I think trying to think of an example. So there's this book called Orbiting the Giant Hairball, which sounds like uh, it's about systems, right? And basically, this guy has figured out a way to navigate through his workplace and figure out a way to stay true to himself while still being successful. So not a lot of schmoozing or networking, but really just being who he is. And so going to meetings that he wants to go to and negotiating so that he can be the most creative person that he wants to be. And I think that's kind of similar to managing shame, is that first acknowledging that we have shame and then figuring out what to do with it, how we want to walk through the world with it. I think the first thing that comes to mind is admitting to ourselves and going deep in the feeling of shame. Why do we feel shame? What is going on with us? And yes, at first it seems like we're almost like wallowing in or exposing ourselves to more shame. But I do believe that shame is like something inside of us that wants to break. And so when we're able to engage with it, it can finally be brought into the light, which is what we talked about so much of getting away from that shame. And so the point of the book was essentially about agency, about which is a fancy term of basically you're in control of yourself. No one else is your boss. You are your own emotional boss, if that makes sense. And that takes some process, and that takes some of being able to be comfortable with ourselves. But I think the first thing is to bring shame to light and allow ourselves to feel that.
But trying to learn how to manage feelings can be really hard.
Yeah.
Especially when maybe for some of us, that some listeners that didn't grow up in a family context where feelings were expressed or talked about, or if you're a guy, then feelings are supposed to be suppressed and not expressed. And so we don't even know the words, much less to know how to process the feelings. I know, I think you were the one that mentioned there's a little chart with faces about feelings. Explain how that might be a helpful tool.
Yeah. I mean, I think we feel it inside, but sometimes when we're not allowed to express it, it really keeps us from knowing how to name them. We know how it feels in our gut or in our in our body, but we don't know how to actually name them. And I think you're right. A lot of families, and then also as a man, I can imagine that there's a lot of push against it. So I think it's a process to figure out how to work out feelings. But I think this chart is such a good starting point, because it's helping us say, oh, I feel sad right now, and it's okay to feel sad. I think if we can learn how to be friends with our feelings, even if it's negative ones, it'll afford us a lot more like scope to feel both the positive and the negative feelings, which is kind of what we talked about in another episode about unearthing our humanness. When we can learn how to express our negative feelings, we can also learn how to embrace our positive ones. And then we can go in a fuller, a more authentic human experience.
Well, that sounds like a really valuable thing to learn. And certainly like a little more coaching to learn about how to manage my feelings, how to put words to them and not feel overwhelmed by them. Because sometimes I do feel like the feelings control me instead of me controlling the feelings.
Yeah. And I think that's where community comes in relationship, and engaging and having these conversations with people. Because when we feel shame, we can feel oftentimes alone. And then added to that is feeling like we're the only person that experiences these negative feelings. And so processing that with other people and engaging with people in relationship, I think makes for a landscape where we can do that and do it not perfectly, and it'll be messy and awkward, but eventually it'll bring us some relief and some healing.
Well, let me close this with this quote that I found in an article, and I'll add a link in the show notes.
Mm-hmm.
And the author says that shame disappears in community.
Mm-hmm.
Reiterate what you were just describing. And that the most powerful way to combat shame is to be truly known and to know others truly. As we share our shame stories or the way that shame has threatened to silence us, these stories are met with compassion, empathy, acceptance, and then shame fades away. It loses the fear of isolation and fear.
Mm-hmm.
And it is our hope that our listeners and viewers would find that community in just a few people. It doesn't have to be a lot of people, just 2 or 3, I think can make a huge difference in your neighborhood. But continue being part of our conversation here on this podcast, because we want to show you what it looks like along the way. And reach out to us on Facebook, on iTunes. You can subscribe. And our website is at erasingshame.com. We would love to hear from you. And thank you for listening. Eunice, great seeing you again.
Yeah, you too, DJ.
Everybody
so
next
much.
week. All right, bye-bye.